Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. But it is from the Jaipur festival. So, you know, they clearly want me to shut this session down immediately. But in a spirit of subversion and transgression, we will continue with these two very controversial people. I mean, you have been set up quite nicely, Jim, and we hope that midnight in the museum will now lead to some lights being turned on. Let me start with you, Jim. Do you believe that the national idea is the cramping and the cramping and limiting idea that functions now in relation to the museum exchange? Is this as restrictive as it seems, or should at some level we respect the national voice and the national will in relation to antiquities, their present location and their repatriation?
Well, first of all, I should say that my views are only controversial among people who disagree with me. They're perfectly reasonable among people who agree with me. But I think one needs to separate out the nation from the state.
Yeah.
So the state has the authority to identify which cultural objects are important to their view of the nation and not others. And they can protect then those that they claim to be important to the nation as they see the nation to be, and then not the other ones. So there is a power that the state has on behalf of the nation, because it represents the nation, as it were, in this entity. And that's what I'm much more concerned with. The nation, to me, is a flexible, organic, developing entity that will evolve over time, that has some relationship to the past, that past of the territorial space in which the nation occupies. But the nation can exist around the world, right? I mean, you can be of the nation of India in Brooklyn as much as you can be in Jaipur. So that I want to distinguish that. And I want to be very skeptical about the state and the state apparatus and the state's role in all of this, because the state has an interest in its keeping its own view of the nation in place, because it affirms the strength and power of the state. So anyway, so your question was whether this is the most important question to be asked. You know, I think the most important question to be asked is twofold. How do we best preserve the past, and for whom do we preserve the past? For the circumscribed few in the territorial extent of the state and nation, or is it a broader public than that?
Irving, I'm going to turn to you in a minute. But Jim, I want clarification on something. In most democratic nations, where there's a fully working bureaucracy, there are regular elections, there is education, cultural education, as well as pedagogical education, that thing which becomes the state is often an outgrowth of the nation and the national voice. So that's my first question. You know, it's not as if there is this complete distinction, and nobody in the nation would also say, you know, except in very problematic political conditions, we bear no connection to the state at all. That's one issue. The second issue is, would you listen more sympathetically to the repatriation of antiquities, for instance, if whatever you consider to be the nation, not the state, and even a binational nation, even a nation with a diasporic population, the Indians in Bloomington, Indiana, as well as the Indians in Bangalore, were all to come together and say, we see ourselves, diasporic, as part of the Indian nation. Now, can you please ship these things back to us?
Well, let me do a couple of things. One is the back to us is extremely interesting, because some of the us live in Bloomington, Indiana.
Yeah, but they might want it to come to India.
Well, that's different, but that's a different question than what you asked, because you asked, ship it back to us.
Yeah.
The us is... Oh, all right. Thank you.
Let me correct. Ship it back to the mother nation. Now, but my question is really on both sides. You know, how would the nation articulate its
That's
demands
the
away
question.
from
How would the nation articulate through which entity might
What
it
would
do
be
so?
the institution?
But I want to say that the nation can rise, the nation and the state aren't coterminous, right? The nation can rise up against the state
Of course.
at any time. And should Donald Trump, for example, become president of the United States, I think you might find a reaction among the nation that's different than the reaction of the state. He'll be in charge of the state apparatus. He won't be in charge of the nation. So anyway, how do I measure and how would I expect the nation in its totality to rise up in agreement about something such as the return of cultural heritage to a place, and that place is only occupied by a portion of the nation? I wanted to distinguish two things. One is the political call for the repatriation, and remember that repatriation is a loaded term. It comes from from being used in the return of prisoners of war, as if things are being held against their will, as if objects have will in themselves, and they're being held against, and they're being imprisoned. And the idea is to return them to their home country, as if they have a home. These are things that are mute in the sense that they are physical matter. This physical matter. These are not things that it can express a view as to the question being asked of this. These are not prisoners who want to be returned to their homeland. So I think there's a distinction between repatriation and the return of objects based on an illegal export of these objects from a place. Because the state has laws, and laws are in place, and those laws are, and anything that was taken since those laws were established, if it's against the law to do so, ought to be returned because that's illegal. They have a legal status. But just because someone says, I think it ought to be returned, is no reason why it should be returned in just that simple fact.
There's a lot to come back to and discuss and unpack on that. And of course, you're right that if Trump comes, it becomes president, we will repatriate to some other country of the mind, irrespective of where it is. But there are times when the two work together. It's not as if they don't work together. But still, let's and I take the point about repatriation and the question of return sometimes, but objects are represented. Those who don't believe in returning objects also speak for, they represent the object. The object never speaks in its own voice. Irving.
Well, I look at this from a much different point of view. Firstly, if we had a general rule of repatriation, one of the things that would happen is that every oil painting by Turner would come back to London. And quite frankly, we have more Turners already in London than we can put up with, and it will be a disaster. And if you had this conception that things are supposed... What? If you had the conception that things all had to go back to their country of origin, and you really applied this as a blanket scheme, the consequences would be absurd. So my view of this is derived from the fact that I work in one of the biggest museums of the world. We have a collection that goes back to the 18th century of unimaginable riches, and we get it in the neck from lots of people, most of whom don't know the circumstances under which things were acquired, don't know why we keep them, or what we're doing with them. But the fact is, I think there is a valid distinction to be made between the historical collections, which have been in position for a long time, on the one hand, and what we do in the future. Does this work or not, this microphone?
Put it in your mouth. Maybe I'll
I tried it, it's the wrong flavour. Have you got another microphone? You've come all this way.
Hello. Good evening. I'd just like to start again from the beginning of my speech. I would just like to stipulate this principle. In my mind, there is a difference between the historical situation on the one hand and what we do afterwards. Most of the material in the main museums of the world has not been there from rapine and theft, but under circumstances which at the time were lawful. And you cannot undo history. So it seems to me, in order to avoid an awful lot of noise and hysteria and flapping about, that the real attention should be focused not on what we should repatriate from before. We should just accept the situation, but we should really pool our resources, intellectual and material, to protect the situation in the world as it is now, and to prevent things being in a position where they need to be repatriated because they were unlawfully captured. These two alternatives seem to me to be distinct, and it blurs matters if you don't keep them separate. Also, I should tell you that all the staff of the British Museum are fully trained killers, and we have we have muskets from the 18th century permanently primed, so that if anybody tries to come up the front steps with any nonsense about we want something back, we just shoot them down. And this is the only way forward.
Well, are these the people or is this the state?
No, not them. No, not them. No, not them.
Jim, do you accept this distinction between the historical collections, the past, and how you would like to look in the future? Do you believe, again, in, the idea of universal museums where, how do you make this, do you hold with the same distinction?
Well, let me try to answer it in a way that I can, which is to say that we need to be very careful when we talk about the land of origin of such things, because the state and the nation aren't, as we said, but coincident, and they overlap in different places and in different times in history. So the current state has a border around it, but such things as that might be determined to have come from that state or from that nation may be on another side of the territory in another state. So it gets a little complicated on those terms, and one has to be very careful. I still think the most important thing is, the things are two. One is, how do we best take care of these things and preserve them? And I'm of the opinion that the distribution of risk is to their advantage. In other words, if they are in many places rather than in a single place, the chance that they're going to be damaged or destroyed in the totality is much, much less. Calamity can happen anywhere in the world, but it's not going to happen everywhere, at the same time. But if it could happen in one place, it could happen in New York City, as it had 9/11 happened in New York City. And if things were all collected in one place, they are at greater risk than if they're distributed in many different places. But the second is, what do we want of the world? Don't we want, as Tagore wanted in 1917 in his great essay on nationalism, to embrace the world and to be proud of the fact that he can claim an association with anything and everything in the world, because we want to rise beyond our territorial borders to a condition of regard for humanity that embraces humanity, not the simple nation, I think.
Jim, that is moving and true, and I remember an excellent piece you wrote, published in the Indian papers, or republished in the Indian papers, after the Palmyra attacks, talking about the preservation of those, or the destruction of those monuments and that whole heritage. So, two things. One, I'm very much with you, and I'd like you to just elaborate. What forms of protection do we now have at an international level?
Yeah, that's very complicated, and I find it very distressing, because we've effectively, the international community, have outsourced the protection of the world's cultural, what I consider to be the world's cultural heritage, to the state. And sometimes the state, which has authority over everything within its territorial borders, as recognized by UNESCO and by the United Nations, is no longer functioning as a responsible entity and an authority. And in fact, it's a failed state. And Syria is such an example. And Palmyra is the perfect case. It happens to be occupied by ISIS, by ISIL. And so the state has no authority over that any longer, because it's been usurped by a terrorist, thuggish group. Yeah. So I think that the current regime is putting at risk the world's cultural heritage, the immovable cultural heritage. Yeah. The movable cultural heritage can move about the world and be protected, but those things that are built, temples, churches, are secular buildings,
libraries.
Are at risk, and libraries, as in Mali, at risk. Yeah.
Irving, how do you think that we can have the protection of these things beyond the relatively inefficient instruments of protection that we have at the moment? What would you suggest as being a system of protection, so that, in fact, people will in time be able to go back and see these pieces which are in situ? We are now talking about works in situ or which are in danger. Well, what should we be doing?
It's a complete illusion to think we can do anything about it. In Britain, for example, all we can do is to prevent things coming into our country through the border. That's the only thing we can do. Otherwise, we just have to wait until the cancerous trouble has been excised by the surgery of fate and the world becomes normal again. But we cannot actually do anything about what's going on in the Middle East to protect material. After all, look what happened before when they sacked the museum in Baghdad, when there was every opportunity to intervene and they didn't. It's a hopeless problem. But I thought we were talking about the question of repatriation of stuff which is so-called outside its country of origin, and this is something which does whip up a great deal of hysteria and distressful waste of emotion, when I don't myself think it's such a complicated thing. As I say, what we should do resolutely is to do nothing to stimulate the trade in illegal illegal excavation and illegal movement of objects. We can do that. We do that. For example, in London, we work with the border police, we work with the customs, we work with the auction houses. Half the dealers in London who used to merrily sell things for money, which came out of Iraq fluently, have all closed down and all disappeared, and it's become socially unacceptable to have on your mantelpiece a piece of antiquity. So in terms of social pressure, it's a bit like smoking. People feel abashed if they buy cigarettes in a public way. People go, oh, tut, you shouldn't be doing that. This is the way to deal with it, to make the whole matter socially unacceptable. Now that seems to me to be rational. It's a consequence of education, of filmmaking, of documentary making, of an exhibition, so that people understand this crucial matter. That if objects are ripped out of the soil by somebody for commercial reasons, divorced from the place of origin and sold on the market, never mind about the question of national identity thereby being injured, which is a bit difficult to defend in my view, but the fact is that knowledge suffers because the context is lost, and what we can tell in the pathetic way we try to reconstruct antiquity is wasted, it's flushed down the loo, and this is a tragedy. And it's not only a question of big black and white emotional principles, there is also this other matter, that it's a tremendous tragedy when all this stuff is in the hands of pirates who don't care anything, and we shouldn't do anything to encourage it. So I think an embargo on anything to be imported, an embargo on collecting, is a good start to the problem. But it is an illusion to think that we can sit about and concentrate, and people who are about to swing a mallet at a sculpture think better of it, because they are driven by forces completely beyond our control.
Thank you so much, Irving. Jim, I think you want to say...
I agree with Irving entirely on this, with an addition to it.
Hold on, I thought you were supposed to be who's controversial, you or me?
No, I think you are.
Okay, fine.
And the thing that I would also add to it is that that reasonable states and their museums, the instruments in which they invested with the preservation of works of art that are claimed by the state for the nation, on behalf of the nation, will not acquire things thought to have been illegally removed from one state or another. There will, however, be private individuals, even within those states, but certainly private individuals and museums outside those states, not responsible. I mean, it's trying to stop the illicit trade in antiquities is like trying to stop the illicit trade in alcohol during the Prohibition era, or trying to stop rain from dripping through a roof. It's going to happen somewhere. So at risk is not just the destruction of the archaeological record that is from which, but the thing itself, these objects, which have other kinds of information that would be helpful for us to understand the evolution of humanity, of humankind. And we don't now allow for something. The British Museum has, I think, one object that at least it's been said in the press from Syria, which is it's holding, as it were, in safe harbor until it can be safely returned. We don't allow in the United States for us.
Excuse me, I just have to clarify things here. Sorry, what museum did you work in?
Irving, let me just finish the sentence.
But this isn't true, what he said. Yeah. The director would shoot me. The situation is there is a law case going on, and this object is evidence, and it's held by us for safekeeping until the verdict is given.
That's it.
That's more or less what I said.
Yeah.
But what I was trying to get to is that in the United States and in many, many different countries, it's not possible to take into safekeeping during a time of crisis works of antiquity, works of art of any portable works of art of any kind, that after stability has been restored, these things can be returned. In fact, in the United States, because of our disastrous invasion of Iraq, we are obliged to return things to Iraq, to put them in harm's way. The United Nations has not taken up the safe harbor. It has an equivalence of this when refugee camps exist, where people who can't be returned or cannot on their own free will go back to their homes and their nations or their states, are held in safekeeping, as it were, in refugee camps. We don't allow that now, so we put them back into harm's way on this, and I think that that's something that we need to address.
Apart from the situation where there is a war, we've been talking about conditions of crisis and violence at the moment. How would you argue the point in countries where there isn't a protection in times of peace, because there isn't the funding, there aren't the resources, there isn't the training? How do you look on that issue, so that there are these great works which suffer, but they are in location, they are in particular national museums, and yet you see that they are not getting the kind of protection, conservation, whatever, that they need. But there is no pressure, to put them in safekeeping. What's the solution there? Do you think there should be a large redistribution, both of knowledge and resources, coming from, wealthier institutions in wealthier countries to help these countries to set up appropriate training and indeed appropriate technologies and appropriate... Let's think more positively about this. What can be done? Is it a question of redistribution of knowledge, technique, skill, and money?
Well, I think it's worth pointing out that the universe is full of forces specially developed to eat books, pictures, ivory, metal. All the things which are in museums are in secure hands at the moment in the West are vulnerable to the same forces. Everything in a museum is vulnerable to doom. This is a fact. Books, objects, carpets, everything is a special thing created by nature to eat it before you can stop them. And we in the museum in London have a constant battle all the time to keep up with this tide of movement. I'm sure in America it's the same. And in many parts of the world, the scale is much bigger. It's vast in India, for example. There are collections all over India where this is a daily problem. And we have knowledge, we have expertise, and in some cases there is even funding, but the general picture that you describe is a kind of global difficulty. And even in the best museums of the world, sometimes people open a drawer after 20 years and they discover that there's dust where once there was an object. It's not necessarily the noisy places that are the best for conservation. This is a really difficult matter, but it's something not connected with this sort of repatriation, who should keep who in their hands. I don't think it's quite the same. Can I just add one thing to the repatriation issue? It's very easy to fall into the assumption that every object in this arena is iconic, beautiful, famous, and important. And of course, these are the ones that the press jump all over. But the big bulk of antiquities which move, which get pillaged, which get sold, are not of this caliber. They are, on the whole, to do with daily life. They are often not complete. And sometimes they are the sort of thing that will drive a specialist into a paroxysm of excitement where any normal person would throw them in the rubbish because they didn't look like anything at all. So there's a whole spectrum of material, of which the iconic material at the top gets all the attention. And I think this is an important thing, because when you look at it as a whole, you realize that it's only a handful of stuff which actually is contentious, which people argue about.
Please, Jim.
Yeah, to your question about the sort of transfer of knowledge and transfer of resources and technology, I think any of us who believe that we have an obligation to preserve the past have an obligation to preserve the past wherever it happens to be. And so if that means a transfer from, let's say, north to south or east to west of this knowledge and technology and resources, the answer is yes. It absolutely has to be that way. If we believe in the value of an encyclopedic museum, like the British Museum, then we believe it ought to be everywhere. That is, that if it promotes curiosity about difference in the world, tolerance of difference in the world, or respect for the historical developments of difference in the world, then it ought to be everywhere. If there's a value in that, we should promote it. And how do you promote it? You promote it by building trust among partners. The Getty, for example, is working in a project developing expertise and networks of exchange of expertise in the preservation and conservation of mosaics, both in situ mosaics and mosaics that are in museums in North Africa and in the Middle East. It's also the Getty is also working in the Middle East in developing the same kind of expertise and relationships of expertise among conservators of photography, because there's great photographic collections in the Middle East. So certainly we've got to do that, but that's going to be, we have to rebuild trust. I mean, that's a post-colonial condition, right, of distrust. So we have to rebuild trust, and we have to rebuild trust by transferring that knowledge, that expertise, those resources, in support of what, if we believe that the institutions we built are to the benefit of all who come to them, then we think that ought to be the case everywhere in the world they exist, or don't yet exist.
Let me ask you about about an issue that stands behind much of what we've been talking about. Take the nation away for a moment and take the state out of the equation. What about the connection between the question, how do we best think the connection between cultural identity and cultural heritage? How do what mediates this relationship? How important is it? And in what ways do objects somehow make that connection, allow that to happen?
So I have two thoughts about this, and then I'll quickly turn it over to Irving. One is that the more we look at works of art, the more we realize that they are moments in time, and that time, and over the course of the time for which they are moments, we are seeing a transformation, a transition, a transmutation of culture. We're seeing they are markers in the transfer of knowledge and expertise and resources, just the kind that we were talking about earlier. So they're never without that. I mean, they bear the trace of relationships. So I think that's important to say. These don't simply represent a nation as if a nation were circumscribed and static. They're dynamic. These are moments in a dynamic development of culture that continues to develop to this day. And so we need to look at these things as that, I think, not rather as I said, somehow indelibly, naturally enclosing, encapsulating a fixed concept of nation and identity. Identities themselves are constantly in flux. Your identity is a perfect example because you were born and raised and first educated in Mumbai, I think, and then educated in Great Britain and England, and then have worked in the United States for such a long time. Your identity is a complex identity, and it's not stopped. Its complexity, right? It's going to change over the course of time. So I think we have to be very careful when we talk about national identity. It is not fixed. It's not indelible. It doesn't permanently distinguish one set of people from another set of people. It is just a moment in time, constantly in evolution.
Irving, can I ask you on this same theme? Yes, of course, identities are continually mobile, but in the situations in which we've been talking, where works are in danger, or often identities get very fixed. They may be artificially fixed. They may be fixed by the state, they may be fixed by religion, they may be fixed by some sense of dishonor or humiliation. So there are moments where these things get very rigid, and then we have real problems. I want to ask you both something. When I have seen, as one sees through the media, the destruction of Bamiyan or Palmyra, the destruction of these objects, which, as you said, Jim, have no inherent will or agency. They have a profound effect on us, but they can't, they don't have their own will or agency. When I've seen that destruction, I have to confess, I have been moved beyond often the statistic that 50 people were shot or killed. I deplore that, and I'm arguing in a way against myself. But somehow, let me be provocative and say, when you see somebody taking a hacking knife and just cutting off something which is, 1,000 years old, there's a sense of violation. There is a profound sense of violation. And it's not because you sit at that point and say, oh my God, the history of the world is being destroyed, which it is, of course it is. But there's a visceral, immediate emotional violation. And somebody's asked me to write something about this, and I was trying to think of analogies. And I thought, in a way, an object is like an old person or a child. They can't really flee. They just have to take it, They have to stand there and take it. This is me trying to understand my emotional reaction, and not my, philosophical or concept, just physically, in the physical. That an object is, in a sense, has that same kind of innocent immobility that a child or an old person has. That's just my response. Can you help me with this? Can you elaborate on why I feel violated? It's not, as I say, because I have the whole, the history of the object in my mind at all, at first. What is it that is so violating about seeing these objects being destroyed?
Well, I think your term visceral is correct. I mean, the simplest way to conceive of this is watching somebody burning books, because people who burn books fly in the face of basic humanity, and this is something which is an offence to humanitarian ideas shared by all normal people. I don't think if you feel this sensation you need to seek medical help. It seems to me to be a rational response. I'm in a funny position here because I work in the British Museum, which is the best museum in the world. And it was described by the best director in the world, saving your presence, as a museum of the world for the world. So we are told this or used to be told this by our director every morning until we started to believe it. And it's actually a rather liberating matter, because implicit in this is that the museum, as we have it, is a kind of temple to the achievement of humanity. I mean, we lost the British Library, it went up the road, that was a big mistake. When I become director, we'll get it back again. So the whole idea would be, under one roof, to celebrate and to document, as far as possible, the whole achievement of humanity. Now, if you have this as your starting point, business about state and cultural identity are footling and thoroughly irrelevant, because they are all to do with politics, which is a temporary, ephemeral issue. We are not interested in ephemeral issues. We are interested in permanent truths. And the whole point of this collection is to put together, in such a way that everybody can see it, as much as we can, of the great achievement of mankind. So, as a curator from the British Museum, I'm liberated from your anxiety about whether state and nation are the same. As far as I'm concerned, they can do what they like, both entities, because a museum is something totally different. Now, there's something else I want to say while I've got this microphone. We have quite a lot of Indian sculpture in the museum, okay. I've never met anybody who really found that an offensive matter, except once in Pondicherry, where I went to a conference, which was a very friendly and wonderful occasion, with lots of international communication between
Fasten
all
your
the speakers.
seatbelt, Irving. Fasten your seatbelt.
Everything was fine until the last morning, when we were going to have a press conference. So we sit on our chairs, and all these journalists are there, and this sweet, beautiful girl with flowers and everything looked at me. She said, "You," she said, in front of everybody like this, "you stole all our Indian sculpture. What have you got to say for yourself?" Like that, in front of everybody. Okay, this is the sort of thing that curators don't look forward to. So, something came into my mind which I still think was useful. And I said to her, "Look, England is full of people who were born in this part of the world and will never come back here. And secondly, it is full of people who will never ever go to India. And all these people can see goddesses, they can see sculpture, they can see painting from India for themselves. And I said, what you've got to do is conceive of the stuff which you think might have to be repatriated, like animals in the zoo. There's one rhino in the London Zoo. It's a pretty bum deal for that rhino because he hasn't got loads of female rhinos, he doesn't get fresh vegetables by his own teeth, he has to put up with it. But everybody in the world can see a rhino. So you see what I mean?
No, I sort of see what you mean, but I want to come back to you, Irving having said what he has with two. One, my first question. What is this thing that we feel, which is not even cognitive, and it may be historical, but it is just immediate? The other question, something Irving raised just now. Of course, there are lots of Indians. I was one of them in Britain. I went to the British Museum. I worked at the British Library every day. I walked through the museum. Now, of course, the fact is that there are millions of Indians who will never be able to see those great works. And that, when we talk about a great world museum catering to humanity, right? And this being the best I'm willing to go along with much of that, but the fact is that much of humanity will not be able to visit these great works that are in collections elsewhere. They may be able to get digital images of them, but they will not experience them. So,
well, let me respond to the second point and then get back to the first point, which I think is the more poignant of the two, as you say, because I do think that the reason one wants to distribute works of art around the world is because people are distributed around the world. One wants to give everybody access to different things in the world, to understand, as I said earlier, and greater appreciate and tolerate difference in the world. So to have everything in one place of one kind deprives most of the world from access to that truth about the world, that it is made of differences. And so we want to encourage that, and we want to acknowledge that just as people move about the world, works of art ought to move about the world. But the first thing, and the more important thing, and the more poignant thing, I think, is I share with you that visceral sense that when things get attacked and destroyed, that are particularly things that are of ancient manufacture, I feel like we've let them down, and the people who made them and all the people who admire them since the time they were made until the time they were destroyed. And the fact that Palmyra gets destroyed, the fact that the Bamiyan Buddhas get destroyed on our watch, for thousands of years they survived all manner of risk. And on our watch they're gone, and gone forever, those that have been totally destroyed. I think that's a terrible thing. And I know that sometimes it's been asked, are you preferring things over people? I mean, you raised that yourself in about some things. I think that's a false dichotomy, because I think people made those things, and people admired those things for hundreds and thousands of years. And for all of those people, we've inherited them. And we've not only inherited them, we've inherited responsibility to perpetuate their safekeeping. And we have on our watch to watch them disappear. And I think that's a terrible thing.
And also what you remind me of is that those people who kill objects kill people.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a very close connection there. But explain one thing to me, and then I want to talk about technology now in the global context, museums and technology and the new technologies. I'm absolutely with you both when you say that, having everything in one place would restrict access. So the distribution is a great thing. But isn't there a maldistribution? Isn't, if you take the Met, you take the British Museum, you take some of the Getty, or you take some of the new museums in the Gulf, which are buying up almost everything they now can of the Islamic, of great Islamic works, with distribution comes maldistribution. And that is a problem. And maybe now there's nothing one can do. There are legal issues, there's nothing one can do. As Irving said, there are historical collections, you can't just pick them up and send them somewhere. But how do we overcome that maldistribution?
Yeah, so I'll give this to Irving in a moment, but I want to insist that the problem of maldistribution is that, and I'll use India as an example, it's not that Indian things are outside of India, ought to be returned to India. It's that there aren't enough of other things in the world in India.
And that was the
Exactly. So that's where I think that's where the maldistribution has to be addressed. Not the return of Indian things to India, but the bringing of non-Indian things to India in greater numbers, so that the benefit of seeing difference in the world is experienced here in India to the same extent that is experienced in London, the British Museum. So I would just turn it away from a concept that maldistribution can be addressed by moving all such things, Indian or all such things, African, whatever, but to make sure that different things end up all over the world. I agree with that.
Yeah, no, but you see also, Jim, that if empire, or the long histories of empire, and of several empires, have actually created these concentrations in specific places, London, New York, Washington, Berlin, etc., etc. Now, it's difficult to think of a historical move that will now bring, great Renaissance painting to the Prince of Wales Museum. You can't even begin to imagine it. That's all I'm saying. That I'm saying there's a historical precedent, and there is a principle of reality. And therefore, I think the maldistribution your aspirations are fantastic, but I think the maldistribution will continue.
But I think,
and that's where I think it's useful, because nobody's going to send, great, as I say, Renaissance or Elizabethan furniture to Bombay. But how do we use new technologies to create that effect of diversity? That I think is a positive.
Very quickly, which is to say that do we have harnessed the benefits of new technologies to transport things safely from one place to another as never before? Things move around the globe more quickly than ever before for temporary exhibitions. Which you see them in Shanghai, you see them in Beijing, wherever you might see them. So there is a way to address that need, I think. But what we want most to do is to inspire and curiosity about difference in the world, and then address that.
Yeah.
It has to be addressed.
Well, apart from loans, there are other practical steps.
Thank you.
Which we not only could take, but we do take. Firstly, many institutions in the world now digitize their collections with state-of-the-art color photographs, which are zoomable and magical, and in many cases rather easier to work with than the original object. And these resources are generally freely available to anybody who wants them. And the consequence of that is that most people can get all they ever need from that resource. I'm the last person to say that the computer is the answer to the world's problems, but very specifically, if you want to see all the paintings of Rembrandt, you can see all the paintings of Rembrandt marvelously in your own sitting room on your own screen. And this has one very strong advantage, that it does undermine the kind of problem that you're asking about. This is one thing. And the second thing is, and it comes into play, for example, in really contentious matters, like, for example, the Lewis chess pieces, which are in London, which they say should be returned to Scotland, where they come from, and all that kind of nonsense. Also, we are on guard. But one way round this problem is that it is possible to generate images, or rather replicas, with laser devices, laser printing, of such a quality that nobody short of an expert can ever tell the difference. Now, I'm not suggesting that there should be any fraudulent activity, but what it does mean that for problem contentious material, a complete set of replicas can be produced which no one could tell apart from the original. Now, this is an interesting matter, because if we're talking about the great unwashed public, they are not the sort of people who are in the business of telling these things apart, and actually they would rather see that than nothing at all in many cases. So it seems to me that there's a kind of medicine with digital resources and high quality replicas which can be distributed very readily, and therefore take some of the sting out of the inherited problem which you are discussing.
Yep, no, this is exactly the kind of way I wanted to look beyond the historical maldistribution, which I don't think can be corrected overnight, but this can actually help, and that was the purpose of my question. Jim. Yeah, and then I want to open up to the audience.
Okay, I do think that reproduction can assist in distributing information about the thing. It doesn't distribute the thing. And I do think there's value in the thing itself, because it not only in the way the thing was made that can't be entirely reproduced, can be closely reproduced, not entirely reproduced, but the knowledge that that thing itself was made at one point in time by some people. That's many, many years ago. Let's call it thousands of years ago, if not hundreds of years ago, and that people have conspired to protect that thing, as I said earlier, for all this time. And there's a magic in that, because that puts us in line with our predecessors. in accepting responsibility for those things. If we can simply say that a reproduction is the equivalent of the original, we have no basis for protecting the original, because we have the reproduction, infinitely reproducible. So while I think that we can convey, and we should, information about our collections freely and widely in the highest quality manner, we can't say that those things replace the object.
Right.
I still think there is an important
Good distinction. Thank you very much. Questions, please. I'm going to take 4 questions. And please make them brief.
Yeah, extremely brief. So, getting straight to the question, my question to the panel is that, thinking solely aesthetically, what are your views on restoring, say, hypothetically, a statue that was defaced by ISIS? Would you say that that was restoring it to its original beauty, or would you rather keep the imperfection as a symbol of history for generations to come?
Good question. Thank you.
I have a quick response, and I'm inclined to your latter point. And I have an example of that. When the Reichstag in Germany was restored recently and reoccupied by the legislature of Germany, they kept the graffiti of the Russian soldiers that had occupied it, so that the legislators who go to take their seats in the Reichstag have to pass this graffiti. This graffiti, which I understand, I don't know Russian, is very, very nasty stuff. And they need to know what it was that caused that graffiti, and that was the absence of democracy. They gave it up to a dictator, and they paid the price. So they are reminded of that every time they walk by. So I think there's something valuable about retaining the history. On the other hand, we have a long, long convention of restoring works of art, but making clear that parts of it that have been added to it, that in the restoration process that have been reconstructed, are clearly visible as reconstructions. We don't want to confuse them, the visitor, the viewer, to think that there is no reconstruction that has occurred, but rather we discolor them differently, or whatever it might say.
Well, I think that's a jolly good question. I think the odd dramatic case is invaluable, but don't forget this, that all the graffiti on the walls will need conservation, and it will be very expensive. It'll have to be retouched on a regular basis by professional conservators.
Right. Question here. I've got 3 more questions. A question here. Question. Yeah,
Hi.
This lady who's standing there. And a question to the gentleman at the back, and I have to take one more because I believe in redistribution. I have to take a question from this gentleman here, please. Yes, that's right. These are our representatives of the people.
Thank you.
Not the nation.
Not the nation.
That's the privilege of sitting in the first row. You get noticed and you can ask a question. I think the panel members mentioned distinction between nation and state. What happens when the state decides one day that they want back things which the nation wants from another nation which was once a state? And this is not a syllogism, but a good example would be the British Empire having a lot of stuff from this part of the world. Suppose one day parts of the empire say we want things back which want ours, because it's a cultural thing. How do you handle that?
May I just say, this is a question, this is an issue that has really, to my view, I may be wrong, been present continually in this conversation. And I think if you just think back on the conversation that the 3 of us have been having, you will get a sense of the difficulties and the temptations of posing that question. So with great respect, I would like to say that I think we've already handled that question. And happy to talk to you afterwards about it. Yes, now. Yes, this lady here. There are only 2 more questions to go, so yep.
My question is slightly different because it doesn't really have to do with the conservation.
Ask your question, dear. We don't care whether it's different or not. Just ask the question.
Okay. How about rocks? Do rocks which are millions of years old need to be conserved or preserved? Because Hyderabad, all the rocks that are completely associated with the cultural heritage of Hyderabad in the last 20 years have completely disappeared.
Hyderabad or Heidelberg?
Hyderabad.
Hyderabad. Yeah.
I mean, I feel viscerally, shattered.
Yeah, this has been the development in Hyderabad. There's wonderful rock formations. You can hardly see them. In Banjara Hills and other places, they've been destroyed. Yeah. Anything to say about Hyderabad at this point, the conservation of rocks rather than the conservation of...
So I guess my question is, I don't know anything about this, so is my question that they're being destroyed because of mining or because of concrete buildings and various things? Yeah.
Or pollution.
IT development, I see. Yeah, I do think it's irresponsible to disregard the history of the place as one develops, and that's why there are typically, I'm surprised there are no constraints there, but typically there are constraints on development, and I would encourage constraints on development.
It's not disregard, it's disfigure actually, Jim, if you see what's happened in Hyderabad. Irving, do you have something to say about Hyderabad?
I'd like to go there.
Okay, well, welcome. Yes, a question there, and one I need on this side too. Yes, this gentleman.
I have one question for you. You've made a very good case for keeping your collections together because of the aspect of preservation of these objects. But do you not think that a lot of the things in your museums have lost their validity by being taken out of their original locations? The authenticity of a piece, say for instance, a hieroglyph from Egypt, is lost when it is taken off out of a temple. It could be replaced. It could be taken back to its original location where it would have greater validity as an object. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't think.
I do think that's a compelling question to be asked. I think, however, that there are simple answers to that question, which is to say that the thing itself tells stories of many different kinds, of which original location is one such story. It doesn't address the authenticity of it. It does address the original constitution of its location, but not this authenticity. So I think that given that it's no longer there and it's not going to be returned to a condition that was original, it will be authentic but not original, that there is a greater argument for its distribution than for its repatriation.
Yeah, the question is that even if it were returned, that would not secure its authenticity because things have happened and changed, in Egypt or wherever itself.
Or it's authentic wherever in the world it is.
One other thing you must remember, that what we have in museums and what's come to us from archaeology is but a fraction of what is still in the ground. And if the world's countries that make all the fuss about this stopped having wars and they excavated their sites, they would have more material than they could possibly even cope with, of the same quality, the same standard, normal, beautiful, iconic. It's all there to be collected. And it's worth remembering it. We don't have all there was. We never will have all there was.
The final question.
To divide custody and ownership so that, for example, Indian government could keep things in places like the British Museum and have the ownership of them.
Yes, well, we actually have an official state policy that the museum can act as a custodian for material which is floating in the world, either because of war or theft, where the issue is to be resolved. And some of this stuff we look after with no expectation that it will go back to its country, its so-called of origin, for a very long time. But we do this, and sometimes we exhibit it and publish it, but we do that. We act as a custodian, and it's always clarified on paper.
Jaipur isn't a museum, except metaphorically. And my guests here today are not museum objects. They spend a lot of time in museums. But they bring with them this kind of redistribution of knowledge, of talent, of opinion. They come from different places. Jaipur brings people together. So it may almost be the kind of ideal museum of human culture and human ideas and human language. Thank you all very much. Thank you.